we are seeing. So when we as a city growing at such a fast pace, we are trying to keep up with the demand, which is increasing
So
rapidly.
let me go right down the row for this first question to Julie Eisel next.
Thank you, Mike. So affordable housing is the issue that we all worked really hard on as a council last year. We created the housing framework, which still needs to be tweaked, but it is a model that a lot of cities across the country are watching that they don't have. How do you work with the private sector, who has also put up $50 million in addition to our $50 million, and how do you use that to best meet the needs of the city, which, mind you, we're just playing catch up. We're chasing a market that's moving faster than we are. One of the things we didn't do is talk about land acquisition. How do you control the cost of the dirt? Because ultimately, that's why these NOAAs happen. These landlords, like Lake Arbor, sit on these, and they don't have to repair them. They can just sell them. And that's the problem we've had. Now, there are things that we could be doing with Lake Arbor that we didn't. For instance, we could and we should look at passing an ordinance for in-rem repairs, that could force a landlord to force them to do repairs. If not, we can place liens on the property and take it all the way to Superior Court to stop them from collecting rent from people that might not be paying rent if they haven't had the repairs.
Jorge Molares, same question.
So it's a very complex issue, and typically to complex issues, there isn't just going to be one or two solutions. There's multiple solutions. It's got to be a multi-pronged approach. And I think we do a good job building units, and we have to build units. That's important. But what are we doing for the folks that are sleeping on a bench tonight? What are we doing for the folks that are sleeping in cars tonight? And we have the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. We got to get creative with the way that we use it in terms of crisis relief. And I also think that it's important to have a displacement metric, right, for us to actually see how many folks are being displaced and see how far back we are. Before the Queen City Unity and working in the nonprofit sector, I was a director of business development and sales and a small business owner. It's all about metrics. And for me, if you don't know and you can't quantify the problem, how many folks are being displaced, you can't solve for it. And we also need to engage our community. Recently, it passed the $17 million. But there was a commitment to the community to engage the community that I thought we could have done a better job as a city. And we have to talk to the people that are living in these situations so they're not surprised by it, Mike.
James Mitchell.
So I think it's about four things I think the city, we need to do a lesson learned from this experience that we can do better. Number one, we need to staff our code enforcers. I really think if our code enforcers had a bigger staff, we could have got ahead of this problem. Secondly, I think the city council need to get involved with its own voucher program. Currently, right now, the Charlotte Housing Authority, the only one can administer vouchers. And I think if we had the ability to do that, those in Lake Arbor, we could give them a voucher to be able to get affordable housing in another area. Thirdly, we need to put this on our delegation. We have a legislative delegation that we work with the state and federal government. We need to put this on our delegation to go to Raleigh and say, give us more control how we really can make our city better. And fourth and finally, we need to make sure affordable housing is not looked upon as something negative. Everyone thinks it's great until it's in their backyard. We need citizens to really understand it's for all people to make Charlotte great, and affordable housing is the thing we must do.
Luana Mayfield.
This is a complex question which has been shared, but we also have to go back through history. Charlotte has a long history of displacement. Lake Arbor is not the first, and unfortunately, until we identify legislative partners in the General Assembly to give us more authority, let's go back to Westwood Apartments. That was 640 units of residents that no one talked about, and it's now Bryant Park. So when we look at the ability that we have, it takes 6 votes on council. There are a number of projects that we have approved, but the community at large doesn't realize, even when we approve a housing project, a new apartment complex, that's 18 months before it comes out the ground. It's a first come, first served basis. We have people who have recently moved to the city that are living in those units. We do not have the ability to have a Charlotte first priority. These are conversations that we have already started with council. Last year we had a excess in our revenue. It was around $600,000. I asked the city manager, can we use those funds to go ahead and start purchasing some of these homes, the single family homes that has renters in them? It probably would have only been around 7 or 8 homes, but we would have been able to purchase those homes for under $80,000 before the new market evaluation came out. We did not pull that trigger. So now that same unit that was once 60,000 is being rented out for more than 1,500 if it hasn't been demolished and a $400,000 home has replaced it.
Chad Stakowitz.
Yeah, so I don't think anyone will argue that affordable housing is probably still the biggest thing in affordability overall that's happening in Charlotte. When I decided to run, one of the things that I think is really important for a city council member to have is to have a plan, not just continue to do the status quo. So I put out the Queen New Deal. You can find it at queennewdeal.com. And this brings together affordable housing, better government, and creating good paying, fair wage, good benefit jobs to create affordability. What that plan does is it immediately asks and adds $25 million to the housing bond that we seek every 2 years. That money we primarily focused into two areas, creating 30,000 new homeowners over the next 20 years. When we look at creating and fixing upward mobility, most people do it through owning real estate, not subsidizing developers' profits. The other thing, especially with Lake Arbor, that we're seeing here is a severe lack of transitional housing. Whether we're talking about Lake Arbor or whether we're talking about our ever-increasing homeless population, we have to figure out ways to be able to move some of these residents that are having struggles quickly, which is why the other thing we'll be doing is opening up an Office of Housing Advocacy, which will be a one-stop shop where people can go figure out the right government programs, that a lot of which we already have in place thanks to some of these council members, but they're very difficult to navigate.
Now, our radio audience cannot see that Braxton Winston is not here yet. He's evidently with his child at a football game, and he's on his way, but that gives us a little extra time. So I want to go back to something that both James Mitchell and Luana Mayfield alluded to, and that is more help from Raleigh, because there are very few tools in the City Council's toolkit to encourage or mandate any kind of affordable housing.
You're exactly right.
Is there a ghost of a chance in any of your minds that Raleigh will give you any more power?
So I'm an optimistic person. and Luana, you are. So I'm going to say part of our delegation breakfast we will have in January 2020, we need to put this on our agenda as one of our top priorities. And I think we have to make the case that allow us who are elected by the citizens to be responsible to take care of Charlotte in the way that the citizens
Do you have a ghost of a chance?
I would say yes.
I would say yes.
Because you're saying it's a ghost of a chance. Here's the reality. We have already, through the Governance and Accountability Committee, have already added it to our legislative agenda, so conversations have started. Where it's really going to come into play is, again, go vote. We need y'all to vote this year for this election, but we also need you to be very active and vote in 2020, because in 2020 we need to break that Senate up in order to get people up there that recognize the importance of residents.
Very quickly, Julie.
And I would say that the mayor has worked really hard this term in rebuilding relationships with Raleigh and the federal government, and that's all part of it. So I think we stand a better chance than we would have before.
Well, just in the nick of time, I'm going to start this next section with Braxton Winston, who has now arrived. Moving on to crime, and we're going to start with you because you're the vice chair of the Neighborhood Development Committee, which oversees policing. In 6 months, we have surpassed last year's total homicide count. There were 57 last year. We're at 70 plus right now, I believe. Corrine Mack, the head of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg NAACP, told the Observer in June she'd like to see leadership from city leaders on this issue. The mayor's office says it's waiting for a study to be conducted by Johns Hopkins University before formulating a plan. Do you agree with that, waiting? And what should city council be doing? What can you do to combat the rising homicide rate and the rising crime rate, which is up 20%? Braxton.
Well, I think we need to split it into two different buckets. You have the bucket of law enforcement, which I think we do a fairly good job with. That's headed by CMPD and our other law enforcement partners in the region. But then you have crime prevention. And I think crime prevention, excuse me, is something that is rests in policy decisions. If you look at where the statistics are, crime is always higher where you have higher levels of poverty. Crime is higher where you have less access to good food or access to education or healthcare options. So we need to continue to push forward on breaking up this crescent of despair and get the folks the kind of economic development that is needed where this is happening. You know, I talk to police officers, I talk to folks that work in the law enforcement community. You know, folks that are going to work are not getting arrested for crimes. So I think that is the way we really work towards crime prevention.
Dimple.
So the way I see this homicides going up, it's small disagreements turning into a violent situation in our city, where we have to start that with developing our young men and women in how to resolve a conflict in a safe and respectful manner. And that starts with some of the youth programming. So recently, city partnered with the YMCA to provide 400 teens free access to the YMCA facilities, which includes not just recreational options, but some of this behavioral training on how to resolve a conflict in a safe and respectful manner. So prevention, it's very important. We also have to focus on recruiting and retaining the best police officers. So earlier this year, City Council actually adjusted salaries of police officers to bring it at the market level. And I think that is important because we are currently understaffed. So if we cannot compete with other cities when it comes to salaries of police officers, we are going to be behind. So we are working on both of those, prevention as well as ensuring that we have actually CMPD that is well staffed.
Jorge Malares.
Yeah, well, we got to kind of get away from the qualitative field things and really just look at, again, quantitative metrics, right? And I'll give you some examples. When we talk about staffing, any operation that's not properly staffed will not be able to function correctly. So I'll give you an example. Columbus, Ohio is the 15th largest city. They start their officers at $57,000 a year. We're the 16th largest city. We start at 44, and that's after the increase. The 17th largest city is Indianapolis, Indiana. They start at $51,000. There's a major delta there. And we have to pay officers more so than the market average. And we have to be, really look at comparable sized cities because it's a lot of work. And in Hickory, it's only 41,000. So there's officers that I've talked to that said, I'd rather go work in Hickory because I'm going to get paid just about the same because the extra $3,000 doesn't make a big difference. And if we can do that, then these officers will be in the community, speaking to people and working with organizations like the United Neighborhoods of Charlotte, which are doing amazing work to reduce gun violence, and we could take a grassroots approach to prevent the crime, Mike.
Lawana Mayfield.
So when we look at the realities on the ground, one of the biggest misnomers is that there's not programs. So a lot of people may not even realize that within CMPD, there are more than 50 programs directed specifically for youth. We have the Mayor's Youth Employment Program. Yes, we have the YMCA's Level Up program. We also have to have a conversation around the reality of, yes, those with a job are less likely to commit a crime, but we have 13, 14, and 15-year-olds that are committing gun-related crimes, and this is their very first offense. So we have to figure out how to do a much better job of letting the community know that programs are out there. One of the things that I'm proud of is this year I hosted my 9th job fair with jobs within the city that have rates above the minimum wage. The challenge is we still don't get to mandate what small business can charge for pay, so we made sure that we increase the pay for our employees. But paying officers more is not just the answer. The answer is, as a community, how are we educating you on the services that we have available, and what do you need in order to access those services?
Chad Stakowitz.
Yeah, so obviously the crime level's a crisis here. I think one of the things that we have to do is Kurt Putney and Spencer Merriweather said that 60% of the violent crimes happen under the age of 30 here in Charlotte. And what that means is that we have an incredible opportunity to touch our young kids. To what Braxton said around economic opportunity, if we were transparent as a community and we built trust with kids early and they understood that they have a great opportunity when they get out and get to work to have a future, we probably don't run into this. To Lawana's point around young kids getting guns, about 10% of the murders were done with a stolen weapon. To the point of lobbying Raleigh, one of the things that I've been asking our state legislators and senators already is there a program that we can implement where when you get your handgun permit, if you take a safety class that we give you for free afterwards, can we help pay for a lot box, whether that's at your parents' house or in your car? So getting better police officers, that's reactive. To solve the problem, we have to be proactive. And so we have to have a multifaceted approach. We can't just keep pushing it back on Chief Putney and on Spencer Merriweather. The council, CMS, the county have to be in this together.
Julie Eiselt.
So this is the issue that I ran on first in 2015. I'm most passionate about it. I started back in 2008 a group called Neighbors for a Safer Charlotte after having been a crime victim. And exactly right, the issue of the proactive interruption of cycles of crime are where been putting our time. That takes time to change, but I brought the vision of the city's Jumpstart microgrant program to the city, and the council supported that. We have for the last 3 budget cycles, where we're helping grassroots organizations that are the interrupters in these neighborhoods, that are the ones that are working with young people, that know the people. They're the ones closest to the problems and closest to the situation. And that's all in the model of looking at a crime as a public health crisis, which is what it is. And so working with those groups, I've been working with Heal Charlotte, with Cops and Barbers, to connect them to resources so that they can build capacity in the great work that they're doing, is what we need to do more of. The second thing is we've got to get outside of our silos. Our 2005 and our Homicide Task Force report and the 2008 Criminal Justice Task Force report all said you work in silos. The city is the police department, the county is the sheriff, and the state is the court system, and we've got to work better together to address these issues.
James Mitchell.
So repeat the question, please.
What could the city do to lower the crime rate and to lower the homicide rate?
Okay, but I thought it was the second part of that the mayor was waiting on a report. Should we wait?
Well, she's waiting on a report to formulate a plan to do that. Should we wait?
Okay, so I don't think we should wait, and I kind of agree with all my colleagues up here. But there's a couple things I would like to add. Number one, we all voted most of us voted to fund the de-escalation training our police officers need to go through. Secondly, when you look at 80% of the homicide, they are domestic violence. So we need to do a better job in the community of developing our young men and young women not to use violence as the way to deal with issues. And I think thirdly, with the help of most of the council members, Councilmember Winston and I, we asked the city council to fund My Brother's Keepers. There's a more tremendous responsibility as me as an African American in a leadership role to conduct the right behavior. So I do think if we continue to train our officers, if we continue as a community to work and train for domestic violence, and thirdly, let's make sure what we do in the community, we are doing the right things to encourage the correct behavior in the city of Charlotte.
You've talked about, all of you have talked about police, you've talked about programs, you've talked about jobs. If you had to pick one, what's the most important? I only need to name the most important thing as we go down the road. Dimple Ashmara. Police, jobs, or programs for youth. Just pick one.
Tough one. I'll say
Well, then we have
Jobs.
to move on. Next, Julie.
Empowering grassroots neighborhood organizations to interrupt the cycles of crime.
Jorge.
Yeah, de-escalation and working with the community have to be it.
James Mitchell.
GOBS. JOBS.
Luana, jobs?
Jobs.
Chad.
Jobs, and specifically getting CMS to put in training programs that allow people to get a job day one without going to college.
Braxton.
Crime is a function of poverty, so jobs.
Okay, so let's segue to something that is a national issue with serious local connections, and that is policing. The fatal police shooting this year of Dunquerius Franklin brought a renewed look at the police use of force, as well as transparency. City Council saw the body cam footage before it was released to the public. After it was released, Council member Justin Harlow, who chairs the Neighborhood Development Committee, told WFAE the city, quote, needed to work with CMPD and with the community on drafting policies to where we can try to prevent things like this from happening, end quote. Jorge Molares, I'll start with you on this. Is the city doing enough to help make sure police are working to de-escalate situations? And is it City Council's job to shape CMPD policies surrounding the use of force?
So, not doing enough, and I believe it is the City Council's job. To me, when I saw that video, I was just absolutely blown away by failure to de-escalate. To me, that is the most important thing. And I've actually had conversations with officers that have told me that needed to be handled differently. And the reason why I'd advocate for paying officers more is because if we had more bandwidth, if we were properly staffed and we could retain these officers, we can invest more time into actually training and de-escalation, which is so important. I look at that video and I say, what happened to hands up, right? Show me your hands. The gun was in his pocket. You say, show me your hands. he would have had empty hands. So we got to focus more on training, and that's why paying officers more is so important, because it gives us that additional bandwidth. I'm sorry, I thought you were going to say something there, Mike. But that's number one. And number two, it absolutely is. We have to revisit our deadly force policy and be more clear and hold officers accountable to it. Because right now there's not a lot of clarity around it, and because of that, we continue to see it happen without any accountability. And there has to be more bite to the policy, and it has to be clearer. So when we know for a fact that someone didn't follow it, there's repercussions to it.
We're talking to the 7 Democrats running for 4 at-large city council seats in the November election and in the September 10th primary. The next person to answer that same question is Luana Mayfield.
Repeat the question.
The question is, what is the city doing enough to make sure that police are de-escalating situations, and is it city council's job to shape CMPD policies?
So most people in here, if you've ever turned on the news, you're going to know that my answer is going to be no, we're not doing enough. And yes, it is council's responsibility because we set policy. It is staff's responsibility, the city manager, to then go implement that policy. There is a clear disconnect with how officers engage specifically with African Americans and Latinos than how we engage with white males. You have a student that walks into UNC, commits mass murder, assaults multiple people, that individual is arrested. You have a young black male who is squatted down between a vehicle with a door open. Unless he had the ability to do a 40-foot vertical jump, he was not going anywhere. So from the very beginning of that video, that officer came in, escalated. There was no de-escalation. That is a multi-year serving officer. They've had the training, or should have had the training. So to use the excuse where they weren't trained, you have been on the force for more than 2 decades. We need to figure out how to address bias when we are interacting with communities of color.
Julie Eiselt.
So I'm not going to say what I would do if I were an officer and somebody was pointing a gun at me or presumed to point a gun at me. So it is tough. These are human beings. That said, it is our job to make sure that the officers in the police department get the training that A, they're asking for, and B, that we feel that we have questions about. So, and we have done that. We have this budget cycle, we funded 6 crisis intervention training experts to embed with the police department. You know, remember, a lot of these are officers that have come up in the ranks. We weren't talking about crisis intervention training a few years ago. So they've got all this training. Now they need additional training. And I think that it is our job to pass policies to make sure they get the funding and the programming to have that training.
James Mitchell.
I raise my hand in favor of funding for de-escalation training. I think our officers need that. I think secondly, it is the city council's responsibility to make sure that we set the policy. And one new policy we need to make sure we pass, if an officer does not have his body worn camera on, they should be penalized. I think it's about transparency and so the community believe that that was a proper arrest. And you know, last but not least, I mean, public safety and crime has a big impact on all of us. And it goes from your neighborhood being safe to economic development. And so this is one thing we have to get right. And you need to make sure you select leaders that believe that crime is the most pressing issue facing Charlotte.
Dimple Eshmero.
So I do believe that it is our responsibility when it comes to transparency. In that case, we were not transparent. What was released to the media was not the same version was shown to us. And I had raised my hand and I said yes, and there should be the equal version what's shown to us and what's released to the media. So I had raised my hand. We have invested in de-escalation training. I had supported that and I'll continue to support it. And when it comes to training and some of this, there should be really mandatory training. Currently, it's up to the officers to decide to what extent they can take the training. But I think this should not be an optional as to a deeper dive, or you can take summary version. All officers should be required to take full training. And that is actually in City Council's control.
Braxton.
So I think the most important policy that needs to be reimagined is the use of force spectrum and the use of force policy that is made off of that. It's something I've asked the manager to consider and ask when he hires the next police chief, which will happen after the RNC next year when Chief Putney retires. But I think the whole Danquarius Franklin incident and how we handle it after speaks a lot more about how we operate internally. You know, I had to raise hell in the media just to get clarity around our policy in terms of turning over video to the courts. It turned out that it was not CMPD's policy that they would present all of the video to the court so the court can make a decision. And I think that really does break trust. It's common sense that we should do that. And so now we have changed that policy internally for that to happen. It's ridiculous that our police officers is not written in policy that you apply first aid when you injure somebody. That policy has been changed. It's ridiculous that CMPD's attorney was not under the city's attorney's purview, but was under the city manager's, and there was no back and forth going there. That has been restructured. So I think this speaks more to how we are structured as a government, and we need to take a hard, comprehensive look at that. That's something I have advocated for, and we have not done in generations.
Chad Stackowitz.
Yeah, obviously the work that we've done with de-escalation training needs to continue, and we need to put more money into that. But frankly, I didn't hear anyone here talk about implicit bias, and the reality is,
I said that.
I'm sorry.
Councilman
I think we have to train all of our officers, and I can give you some data around this, whether we're talking about shootings or whether we're talking about getting pulled over. In 2017, for a while, the Open Data program here published all of the arrest data, and what that data showed is that if you were black or a person of color, you were twice as likely to have your car pulled over. Yep. After you were pulled over, you were over 4 times more likely to have your car searched. And so whether or not we're talking about a traffic stop or we're talking about a situation where someone has a gun, if our officers aren't trained right, and if we're not transparent as a community about everything that we have done, then none of the stuff and programs we're trying to do are going to work because people won't trust the force. The reality is 99% of officers, just like 99% of teachers and 99% of people, are great and trying as hard as they can. Our police officers do a great job, but we need to do better.
One incredibly quick follow-up. Dimple said that the film, the tape that you saw on City Council was different from the tape that was released to the media. Was it more revealing? Very quickly.
It was shorter. What was released to the media was shorter than what was presented to us.
Actually, what was presented to the court was shorter.
Right.
And the only way we found out was by a mistake by a CMPD's
Yes.
officer in showing us the entire, and we would have never known about our own internal policy.
Also, yes or no, body cam footage, should we have a no-tolerance policy for officers not having their cameras on?
Yes.
No tolerance, yes or no?
Yes,
Dimple?
Absolutely.
Julie?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
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 All the way down the line. Okay. Charlotte is hosting, here it comes, folks. We're hosting the Republican National Convention.
Okay.
It's become a flashpoint. We're a year away from it. It divided Democrats last summer when the decision was made to pursue the convention. Since then, the council has rebuked the president for, quote, his racist and xenophobic comments. There was even discussion recently about whether or not the city should back out of the contract. Councilmember Larkin Eggleston, who's not here tonight, who cast a deciding vote last year in favor of the convention, has said, quote, it's a futile exercise to play games of what if we voted the way we voted. We're going to be as prepared as we can be. So for those of you who have been on council during the debate in these decisions, do you have any regret in the way you voted, in voting in favor of it or against it for the convention? And for those of you who voted against this or who were not on council, should this even be an issue in this primary? Should the city just simply move on and make sure we do the best job we can of hosting it? Julie, yours was one of the yes votes. Mm-hmm. Talk to me.
I don't think there'd be anything for the media to talk about if we just moved on, so we'll start with that. I think the process I really regret. I look at it. When it first came before council, 10 council members said, yes, move forward. One council member said, we're going to show them our Southern hospitality. Right. 10 council members told the mayor to go ahead and negotiate with the Republican National Committee. She did that. Chief Putney went to Washington, D.C. a couple of times. When it was brought before us, it was pretty much a done deal. Mm-hmm. So then you have to say, all right, what are the risks if they're at our door now and we have to back out? For me, it was about the airport. I have no doubt that would have been at risk because we've seen that happen before. And the second thing is we were negotiating. Now we know we were negotiating Honeywell at the time. So when I think about it and I think about economic development, you can say that doesn't matter. But if you've got a CEO who wants to move 750 to 1,000 jobs here, and they have employees that are Republicans or Democrats, they don't want to see a city flake out like that at the last minute and back out of a commitment that they made.
James Mitchell, you've said at one point, you said this is not what you signed on for, so I'm just curious.
Yeah. Well, so with shared economic development, I think I always look at things a little differently, and I'm going to tell you the reason why I voted yes. I think, number one, Charlotte would be only the fourth city in America to host both the DNC and the RNC. Number two, it would generate $100 million for our local economy. Number three, 1 out of 8 of our residents work in the hospitality industry. And number four, probably more important for me, we had a hit list of probably the top 12 CEOs. Guess what party they was affiliated with? They were Republican CEOs. And so I saw this a great opportunity to show what Charlotte's really about. We embrace diversity. Was I the first one also to sign on and vote for the resolution? Yes, I was. Because we have a code of conduct in Charlotte, and we don't like bad leadership, divisive ways. And so I'm proud to say I voted for it, but I'm more proud to say I'm going to protect our image when RNC comes to Charlotte.
Luana Mayfield.
I am very proud of the fact that I was that only no vote because it wasn't regarding the RNC, it was regarding this administration and the amount of hatred and vitriol and misogyny that we have seen from this particular administration. For me, it wasn't a dollar conversation. The impact on our community when an individual sends out a tweet that has more than 100,000 people show up in protest, I was concerned about after the RNC, what happens to our city, not alone what happens during with that many people coming in to the area, the negativity, the hatred. We are a majority minority community. And yes, Uptown saw a boost during the DNC, but we never talk about all of the small businesses that are situated in Uptown that had to close their doors because of all the security measures that lost money. We don't talk about the negative impact of hosting a major convention, and also Charlotte is number 6 in trafficking. So I was more concerned about the negative impact on our city than the idea of potentially creating $100 million.
You mean human trafficking?
Human trafficking.
Okay. Chad Stakowicz.
Yeah, I'll show my transparency here, even though it's not popular. At the time, I probably would have voted for it, and now I'd be sitting here regretting it. And I would have done that because I believe that city council represents everyone in the city. You represent people that don't agree with you at all. And the reality is we're supposed to be out there and we're supposed to be bringing people together. What I don't believe in is that every Republican out there is bad. Do I believe Donald Trump is a racist xenophobe? I do. Do I want him in our city? I don't. Do I believe that people vote Republican all believe that? I do not. And so at the end of the day, I think when we had Pat McCrory as governor, if we would have been able to bring the DNC and he would have been like, no, don't bring the DNC, I don't agree with any of that, we all would have been up in arms too. And so for me, this issue is two things. It's about what's best for our community. I don't think it's going to be what's best for our community now that I've seen what I've seen. But on the flip side, I don't know how we ever recover this political divide that we have if we don't sit here and like try to pretend that we're all neighbors. We all live here. We all care about most of the same things.
Braxton Winston.
Just for clarity, when the mayor called, initially they called one-on-one. This was not a group meeting. I told the mayor that, no, I do not want this RNC to come, but I believe in conversation. I believe in public conversation, and I thought if we were going to put a bid in to do this, we needed to foster that public conversation. Specifically, as an at-large member, when you represent the entire city, you try to get as much input as you can to make the right decision. My only regret is that I would have pushed that public conversation a lot earlier, because there was a lot that was happening that wasn't shared information amongst the whole council. This was the mayor and a couple of council members that were informed about how the process was going. And we learned about it in its entirety when it was kind of put in our laps and said, we have to do this, there's no pulling back. I'll tell you what, the letters that came to us a couple weeks ago have had me reimagine how we need to approach, because I don't want to employ the tools of our oppressor. This idea of creating walls to keep folks out when the problems already exist here in Charlotte, that's what we need to be focusing on between now and then. Getting our house right, making sure our businesses, our community organizations are able to make statements just like that we made as a council, denouncing the xenophobia, the racism that exists, and taking steps to correct the conversation that's happening right here, right now.
Jorge Malores.
Yeah, well, I want to preface this by saying I have the utmost respect for everybody up here, but I think anybody that knows me knows I would have voted against this. And to me, I'm a son of immigrant parents, and when I hear folks say, send her back, and everything before that, right, because it was way before that. I mean, there were many, many signs, in my opinion, that would have led me to say, we don't want to bring it here. And it's not because it's not an anti-Republican movement. It's because I believe the Republican Party has been hijacked by Donald Trump, and it's not the Republican Party of the past. And there's many Republicans that I talk to that say, I am not proud of my party right now. And the energy that it brings here to Charlotte it's extremely dangerous. And when we think about the $100 million boosts or so that it could bring, we got to start thinking a little bit more long term, in my opinion. And when we think a little short term, you can get $100 million boost, but what happens if there's mass civil unrest on a grand scale here, on a worldwide scale, and we're watching this all over the news? Charlotte will forever be remembered as a center of bigotry, hatred, and the place that welcomed it, and the businesses that will leave, and the negative impact on tourism is unquantifiable, but it will happen.
Dimple Ashmira.
So there is no secret to how I feel about President Trump. I have said it in 2017, I have said it in 2018, and I'll say it again. Trump values are not Charlotte values. And as Braxton said, there was not a vote when we submitted the bid. It was one-on-one conversation, and I was not comfortable with it at a time. And we were asked that out of formality that we had to submit a bid. And when we talk about the RNC vote, I had actually voted against it. And then I was asked, let's take emotions out, and let's only take the business case. So even if you take the business case, in 2012, we hosted the DNC and we received $50 million. In 2020, $50 million, same amount of money, with a lot more higher risk. It does not make any business case either. So when we look at some of these scenarios and consider the risk, it does not make any sense for us to host the RNC. There are no other cities wanted to host the RNC because it's toxic. No one wants to touch it. And that's why my stance has been consistent against the president.
Okay, it is clear that Panthers owner David Tepper wants a new stadium with a retractable roof, and he wants it within the decade. He has suggested a hotel tax revenue as a potential source of funding, but there could be pushback from business and from taxpayers on that. Can you imagine it? Is it in the taxpayers' interest to help subsidize an NFL stadium, especially since David Tepper is the wealthiest NFL team owner in the country? And what would the impact be if we didn't and he moved the stadium to South Carolina? James Mitchell, you chair the Economic Development Committee.
Where's the love?
And were instrumental in getting taxpayer funds to support stadium renovations in 2013. You start.
So I will always think the right model for us is to use our hotel tourism tax fund to take care of all of our sports need, all our tourism need. Because it's really those who come to visit our city that we generate that fund. I do not think we should raise property taxes to build our sports facility. And so I'm a big fan of all the sports here, all the tourism. You look at Discovery Place. Discovery Place is #1 tourism in the whole state of North Carolina. And so I do think we should use our tourism fund to build or to use those funds to make sure that we keep the Panthers here. Let me tell you a quick story. I was on the Charlotte City Council, and we lost the Charlotte Hornets. You do not want to be sitting as a representative when you lose a professional franchise. You're on the front page of ESPN, CNN, and it does give your city a negative mark. That's a great asset we have over there at the Bank of America Stadium. One of 32 cities to have an NFL football team. And I would tell you, you hear pride just like me on Monday and Thursday night when they say live for Bank of America Stadium. In what city? Thank you.
Chad Stakowitz.
Yeah, so I'm a CEO, and every investment that I make is based on what the return in investment is. And you asked about the negatives. Well, I don't know the exact number, but I'm assuming it's $20 to $40 million a game comes into the city from outside spending. Yeah. So right there, you've got $160 million in economic activity every year. I also think like there's ways for us to have leverage and make money back, whether we request a share of concessions, whether we request a share of parking revenue, comes back to the city. We're also looking at MLS. I would want to know all those details. I also think, and I've heard from a lot of taxpayers, they don't want to pay for it. I know a lot of people up here won't like it, but I think it should go to a referendum again, frankly.
Wow. Jorge Molares.
Yeah, I think it's a very challenging question to answer, Mike, because we don't have details, right? At this point, it's just a vague ask. But we do have a lot of other issues that we need to focus on. And I'll say, if we can monetize it and recuperate what we would be asking in taxes, then I would think about it. I'm not saying yes. But we don't have an ask, right? And at the same time, we talk about the branding. Well, it's the Carolina Panthers, so why don't we ask the state as well, right? Or otherwise, let's call it the Charlotte Panthers. So I think there's a lot to talk about there. I think, quite frankly, we have a lot of issues right now as a community. I don't think it's the time for it. But the one thing we don't do often as a city, and I'd like to see happen more, is let's engage our community. We have a lot of boards and commissions, a lot of folks serving on there. What do they think? What does the rest of the community think? And let's get their thoughts. And to me, that's how we should make decisions, not necessarily based on what 11 or 12 people think, but what the community thinks.
Dimple Ajmera.
So I would like to look at our tourism bucket. So when we consider any sports facility or cultural facility, the funding comes from our tourism bucket, which cannot be used for anything else, whether it's housing, infrastructure, or so on. So I just want to make sure that is clear. So I would be interested in looking at what the capacity is for a tourism bucket and what the ask is, and what is the return on investment. So if that all makes sense, I would actually support it, because at the end of the day, it does bring a lot of economic impact. I remember when I was in college, I worked at a hotel to help pay for my college, and it does create a lot of jobs for our Charlotteans, and we need to consider that. And we need to consider what we are getting as a city. So that way, 2 months later or 3 months later, after we make the investment, team doesn't leave. So we have to make all of those decisions early on. We gotta have a solid contract. We gotta look at our return on investment, and we got to look at what's at stake when it comes to overall GDP impact.
Luana Mayfield.
So I was on council when we had the last conversation regarding the Panthers, and I will admit it took quite a few meetings to get me there in support. And even then, that support was initially supposed to be a 15-year tether that had the state and the county financially invested. Had we done that 15-year tether, we might not be having this conversation now. We have not actually received an ask. There's a lot of conversation in media regarding what the ask could be. I would like to know what the financial investment would be from our state, because it is the Carolina Panthers, not the Charlotte Panthers. I would like to know what the investment will be from the county, because they will also benefit. I agree that the number of jobs that are created through the impact of having a NFL team in Charlotte, our hospitality and tourism will see a financial gain, but to the detriment of what? I would like to see exactly what is in the contract and know that council has some very clear expectations of what type of tether are we looking at to ensure that we do not make a large financial investment just to turn around and in less than 5 years have this conversation again.
Julie Eiselt.
So my colleagues have really hit on it, that this is a financial decision that we have to make. We're talking about the stadium. We wouldn't be writing a check to Mr. Tepper. So the stadium's our asset. At the moment, it's only being used 10 times a year, and that's not a very good return on your investment. So if we're being asked for improvements so that the stadium can be used for other purposes, if it's soccer, soccer is a whole nother season than football, you're doubling the revenue that you bring in now for that asset. Game day, Panther game days, the tax that we bring in, the hospitality tax, 40% of that comes from outside of Charlotte. So that's a pretty good leverage ratio. We're getting that money to cover that from the people that come into the city for those games. So the tether is important. How long, if we're being asked for a retractable roof, how long are they planning on being there? How long are we getting what's the commitment to stay there? If they want to then 2 years later build a stadium, that's not such a good deal. So we have to have all of that tied up ahead of time. And until we really have that financial ask, it's pretty hard to say.
Braxton Winston.
Well, I look at dealing with the Panthers just like I look at dealing with any other business that wants to come into our city. How are you going to help us and collaborate with us to attain our goals and our priorities in this city? As my colleagues have said, there is no ask here. But Mr. Tepper has shown that he does want to partner with the city towards our priorities. So are there opportunities? I don't think it is wise. I don't think the numbers show that public dollars invested in a structure have a return on investment, but are we able to invest in transportation or traffic infrastructure that surrounds the stadium? Are we able how are we going to fit this into a greater economic development plan? And can we partner on that? Is there an opportunity to make this stadium carbon neutral so that it helps us reach our Sept goals and our 2050 and 2030 and 2050 goals? I think that is the type of conversation that I will look to have should we have the opportunity to have that conversation. But I also agree with Smudgy that we have to reevaluate our plan for how we invest our tourism dollars, period. If we look at the type of revenue that does come in, the arts and cultural sector far outspends those NFL dollars that come in 8 to 10 games a year. So I think we need to really take a fine look. And again, it goes back to what I said earlier. We need to reevaluate how we do our business, including how we spend our tourism dollars.
We have 45 seconds. So the next city council will be in office when the state's moratorium on local non-discrimination ordinances is lifted at the end of next year. Would you consider trying to pass a new non-discrimination ordinance like the one that led to HB 2 when that is lifted? Just yes or no, right down the road, Dimple Ejmera.
Yes, with collaborating with other cities.
Yes or no, right
Yes.
down the road, Julie.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
All yes. What happens if the state comes back with an HB 3?
Ooh.
I hope they
Across
learn
the
that.
We've got veto now.
Yeah.
Collaborate
We
with other
stood
cities.
by our principles. We are a welcoming city, and we want to make sure that everyone is welcomed and protected in our city.
And that is Luana Mayfield. She, along with Dimple Ejmera, Julie Eisel, Jorge Molares, James Mitchell, Chad Stakowitz, and Braxton Winston are the 7 Democrats running for the 4 at-large city council seats. Early voting is underway. The actual election day is September the 10th. The winner of this primary is likely to be the winner in the general election in November. I want to thank all of you for participating in this tonight, and I want to thank the audience for being quiet during all of it. Thank you so much, and thank you for listening.
Charlotte Talks with Mike Collins
now,
is a production of
let's kill that.
90.7 WFAE.
Let's kill that.